Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Tracy.
What's going on?
Not much. I feel like we haven't talked in a little bit.
I know I was away this weekend, as you know, in Alamogordo, New Mexico for this event, semi-intimate, 90 people, to honor my remote viewing trainer, Lynn Buchanan, who's been interviewed on this podcast. So it was good to do that. Met a lot of really interesting people, a lot of really psychically skilled people. But I'm glad to be, there's no place like home. So I'm glad to
Right.
be back as well. Good to do things, good to come home.
Yeah, I think that's one of those feelings that you have where it's like sometimes the best part of going on a trip is coming home and appreciating being home. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were exploring, which is part of what you're supposed to be doing.
I was, I saw shooting stars because the sky is
Wow.
incredibly clear there. Supposedly there are a lot of UFO sightings. I'm not a big UFO
Yes.
person. I kind of
Oh.
hope to never be contacted. That's like an open secret for me. I'd like, please don't contact me.
So people always ask me what I'm afraid of because there's
Afraid of
very few
pretty much
things
nothing.
that the only thing that actually I'm afraid of is UFO abduction. And the reason is
I can think of
that,
many.
well, the one for me, it's this. It's like if someone breaks into your house, you can call the police, right? If there's a ghost in your house, you can call a paranormal investigator. If there's a demon, you can call a priest. Who do you call if it's a UFO? Like it feels like there are no, it feels like there's no hierarchy to that. Like there's no telephone number to be
I
like,
don't
hey,
know.
knock it off.
Yeah. So this is one of those things where like people will say like ghosts don't exist because they don't want to have them. It's not that I believe aliens aren't real. I just try and keep it locked behind like a foot thick lead door
Right.
in my
Yes.
mind.
La 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 la.
I know. It's like just I don't care if it's the best or worst experience somebody else has, just please keep it away from me.
So that's an interesting segue, because the case that I'm going to present to you today is actually
Okay.
one of the most famous abduction cases
Good
in
Lord. I had no
very
idea.
strange. I know. And that's why I was like, and I literally just picked this out of a stack today. So while we were sitting here, so the idea
That's
that you
crazy.
said that, I was like, it's the perfect little, segue into this.
It's telepathy,
It
honestly.
is.
I'm
Well,
not kidding. People can think what they want, but seriously, we did not talk about what
right.
cases you were going to present
No, and I didn't know what case I was going to present until I just chose this one. And I chose it because it's a little bit different from everything that we've been doing.
or
So
precognition. I don't know what it is.
it's the Travis Walton abduction case,
Okay.
which is for those of you who are familiar with any kind of alien or abduction folklore. I don't even want to say folklore. Folklore is probably not a right word, but history. The Travis Walton case is known as the Fire in the Sky case because there was a film made in the late '90s about it,
It's
and it is one of
uncanny.
the most. It's certainly one of the most famous. I would say it was a very controversial incidents in the history of UFO and alien abduction lore. It occurred in 1975, and it involves Travis Walton, who's still alive and still actually kind of tours talking about this. But what's really interesting about Travis Walton is his perspective on this event has changed through his life. So it was a hugely important moment in his life, but how he views it has changed in the years since 1975. And wow, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of that. So that's
That's
actually really cool. He was a logger, and he claimed to have been abducted by extraterrestrials while working in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. Uh, it was We're going to talk about the details of his abduction, the investigations into it, the public reaction, and this was something that I would say impacted his life, but also just it consumed his life. It consumed his life for the last 49 years. It's still something that he literally travels the world talking about this. And its implication on kind of like the study of UFOs, alien encounters, and how it's changed the the perspective internationally, but very specifically in the United States. So Travis was born in 1953, and he was born and raised in Arizona. Before he was abducted, he worked as a logger and was employed in a logging crew. I think there was 5 or 6 guys in the national forest. He was described as reliable, hardworking. He had no history of any kind of mental illness. He was not a person that was known for any kind of substance abuse. And these were factors that, after what he claimed and after what occurred, became part of the investigation. And people, because people obviously started looking at the credibility of his account. And so they looked at his history and whether or not he'd had any mental illness, whether he was a drinker, whether he was a person that used drugs. And none of those things were anything that he was known for. The crew that he was with included crew leader Mike Rogers, Alan Dallas, Kenneth Peterson, Dwayne Smith, and a few others, but those were the core group of guys. They were a very close-knit group. They were known for their professionalism and reliability, and they worked together. The crew's testimony would become a crucial part of this case, and their accounts would support Walton's claims of abduction. So this was something that happened to him, but there were parts of it that were witnessed by other people, and it affected these people as well. So this wasn't just something that affected Travis Walton. This affected his crew, and I'm going to say his larger community as well. So on the night of November 5th in 1975, the logging crew was coming back from work when they encountered an unusual sight in the forest. According to Walton and his crew, they saw a strange glowing object hovering above the ground. The object was described as saucer-shaped, and it was a craft with bright lights, which emitted a powerful beam of light. Travis Walton, so they're in a truck, they're coming down the mountain, they see this structure hovering in the sky. It's a flying saucer, for lack of a better word. It's emitting a glowing light. Travis actually, they stop the truck dead in its tracks, and Travis actually gets out to take a look at it.
Don't get out, Travis.
Yeah, I mean, and the way it's kind of described is like it was almost like he couldn't help himself. Other members of the logging crew got out as well, but didn't approach the craft. As he approached the object, a beam of light reportedly struck him, causing him to lose consciousness. The other members of the logging crew, in a state of panic, fled the scene, fearing for their safety. So he gets knocked to the ground. They're just scared. They get in the truck. They haul ass down the mountain. So after Walton was struck by the beam of light, he was reported missing for 5 days. So they get the truck. They go back down to town. No one knows where Travis is, and they don't know what happened to him. They only know what they saw, but nobody else in town knows what happens to him.
Sorry, Kathy, he's knocked down by the beam of light, but did they see him vanish, or does he get sucked up into the craft, or he's just
that's
lying
something
there?
that they'll talk about later. But they get back. So he's knocked down. They see this thing. They get in the truck and they just haul ass. And I think they presume at some point. I don't know if they thought he was dead but they're just scared, right? So they're just scared. They get in the car. And I think some of them were kind of like, we told them not to go close to it, but they're so afraid they just want to get the hell out of there. They're literally panic stricken. So after he's struck by the light, he was reported missing for 5 days. Now, during this period, a massive search was conducted by local authorities, his friends, his family, even the guys that he was with. Now, despite this extensive effort, there was no trace of him, and leading to some believe that he might have disappeared voluntarily. In other words, he might have skedaddled, or that he had met with foul play. And this becomes a big part of the story. So on November 10th, 1975, now remember, they're looking for him for 5 days. these guys have told their story. People either believe them, don't believe them. Most people didn't believe them. Most people think that Travis met with foul play, which means that they believe that the other loggers had something to do with it. So now it's 5 days later, and Travis Walton reappears. And he reappears disoriented, in a state of extreme distress, at a gas station 20 miles from where he was last seen.
Good Lord.
He's taken to a hospital where he's examined by doctors. He exhibits sign of physical and psychological trauma. He has burns all over his body and a high level of anxiety. So he says, after he gets back, he provides a detailed account of his abduction, the experiences that he had. And according to him, he was taken aboard a UFO and encountered alien beings. He describes the craft as being inside a large metallic structure, and he saw 3 humanoid aliens with large heads and eyes, very similar to what we now consider to be kind of like the standard,
like
alien.
The Greys.
Yeah, the Greys. I mean, I'm not sure they were Greys, but remember, this was 50 years ago. So his description is part of why we think of aliens in this way, right? So he claimed that he was examined by the aliens and then placed back outside the craft. According to his account, he included descriptions of the craft's interior, the appearance of the aliens, and his feelings of fear and confusion. His story was consistent in details, the dozens of times he told it, and researchers do find this very compelling. And others look at it and say it sounded scripted, but he never deviates in the telling of the story. So the initial investigation into his disappearance and reappearance involved local law enforcement and the FBI, so the local FBI office. The authorities conducted... Now remember, this also happened on a national park, right? So that's federal jurisdiction. So there were people who thought that he had been murdered. The loggers that he were with absolutely dealt with suspicion for those 5 days. So in addition to the guilt that they felt at having left their friends, the terror that they felt in having seen this craft, they also were suspected of having killed this guy. And so they were combating that while also looking for him and kind of believing, aliens had taken him. The authorities conducted interviews with the logging crew, with their friends, with their family. The crew members consistently supported Walton's story, claiming that they had witnessed the UFO and his abduction. So they did say that they saw him being abducted. The police investigation initially considered the possibility of Walton's abduction being a hoax or a result of foul play. However, the consistency of the crew's accounts and the lack of evidence supporting alternative explanations led to a more open-minded approach. In other words, they kept pounding these guys and they were never deviating from their stories. And so ultimately, at some point, they started to think, well, maybe there's something else going on here. And I don't think that happened immediately. I think that happened over the course of time. There's a great documentary on this as well that was produced about 10 years ago. And there's like in-depth interviews that were done where they talked to the FBI agents and, were wholly resistant to this, but said at some point we have to look at this and say, well, maybe there was something that they thought was an alien abduction. You know what I mean? So they started to be more open-minded to the idea that something happened that people could have perceived as being that. In the aftermath of the incident, Walton and most members of the logging crew underwent polygraph tests to assess the truthfulness of their statements. So they actually did. Yeah, let me take a test. And the tests themselves are often, they're not reliable, but the willingness to take them, because I'm not in any way implying whether or not these guys were intelligent people but there was a certain point at which they believed that they were taking a polygraph test, that it probably was somewhat reliable. And so the willingness, they weren't going to go to court. They weren't going to probably go to jail, but they wanted to be believed. And because they were being accused of something. And so they were looking for any way that they could to kind of clear their names as hoaxers, or clear their names as people who had done something nefarious to a friend of theirs. And so their willingness to take that is far more compelling than whether or not the polygraph test would be admissible in court. And of course, the polygraph tests are considered inconclusive, right? So the information comes back, but that's not necessarily in these specific cases, but in paranormal cases in general, they're considered inconclusive because of the emotional component to the experience, and because you're dealing with the beliefs of people as well. So no one is saying that they were vague, or that their polygraph tests showed that they were lying, just that the information was inconclusive, because how do you compare it to something else? Because it's paranormal, it's paranormal in nature. Walton's medical examinations reveal significant physical evidence of trauma, including burns and abrasions. And while these injuries were consistent with Walton's account of being struck by a beam of light, they did not conclusively prove an extraterrestrial encounter. In other words, he got hit by something, but there's no way to know that it was extraterrestrial in nature. The medical evidence was considered suggestive, but not definitive. So, and I find that interesting, because a beam of light, you mean you mean something that has radiation. So it would not just be a beam of light. It would be something that was powerful enough to cause physical damage, because you could be struck by a spotlight and it's just going to light you up. It's not going to actually damage your skin. So it would have to be something that had some kind of radiation to it that would cause those kind of burns, or heat, obviously.
And Kathy, his recollection is that beam is what caused the burns, or he doesn't know?
At this point, they're not saying, but yes, that's
okay.
That's ultimately what it is. So the case attracted significant media attention immediately, with numerous news outlets covering the story. The case was featured in newspapers, television programs, magazines. This was the era of the Inquirer and the Star and things like that, and a lot of times they were right. Contributed to its prominence in the public eye. It was also a time of 3 television networks and local coverage, right? Yeah. So there wasn't a million places to get information, or a million places to get stories. So a story like this is going to garner a ton of attention, because it's weird, and it's unique, and it's 1975. Right. So in 1975, there was a big interest, a big growing interest in the paranormal, and particularly in extraterrestrials as well.
Do you know when the Communion came out? I think
it was 78. I'm not really sure.
I can't remember.
I'm not sure. But
I have it somewhere, and I didn't even finish it.
Because remember, Close Encounters was right around then. Close Encounters was, I think, like 1976. So, and I do think that all of these kind of fed into that, but it's also, it's 1975, it's within 12 years of us landing on the moon. So there's lots of stuff that's, or 15 years of us, actually, when did we land on the moon?
In the late 60s?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're not even talking about 10 years. So the idea of there being visitors from another planet when we just started visiting other planets is exciting and completely feasible to some people. I will say, though, if you believed this stuff in 1975, you were considered to be kind of super fringe.
Honestly, even now, I would not consider it. I would consider it much more popular and not mainstream. That's just a thought.
I would say that if you 30 years ago, if you claimed that you believed there was life on other planets, you would be considered a lunatic by the mainstream. And I would say today, if you said there is no life on other planets, you would be considered a lunatic. However, because I think people just accept that the universe and that the galaxy and that the experience or that which exists is so vast that the idea that we're the only ones with sentient life is really kind of a bizarre thing to hold. But the idea that they're visiting us, that's a different argument. That's a different can of worms, and I think that there's still people who would really be pushing back on that, because there's a lot of plot to this, right? Like there's a purpose and a plot. Then I think a lot of people are saying, yeah, I can believe that there's water on another planet without believing that there are reptilians coming to the Earth, and
God, I hope not.
yeah, I don't know.
I just don't want it to be so.
I don't know. I don't want it to be so either. And you know what? Don't at us. We're open to everything, but I don't. I think a lot of the subjects that we cover, I think sometimes people's explanation of their experiences fall into certain narratives, and they may or may not be the right narrative. And that's why I find this case really interesting, because his narrative changes. His experience doesn't change, but his interpretation of his experience changes over time. And I find that really, really, really interesting.
So how did he change his interpretation?
Well, we'll get to that. So now we're still dealing with this, right? So obviously it becomes a huge story, right? And if you go on YouTube or you can find this. There's lots and lots of books written about this, and there's lots and lots of stories. And Travis never backed down from talking about it. And a couple of the loggers never spoke about it, but then ultimately did. But it became something that it changed their lives, and not for the better, largely, right? Because it was something that they were afraid of, but they also were kind of tarred with, the brush of being liars, or, in some way doing something illegal, or doing something wrong, or being hoaxers or something like that. So the case became a cultural touchstone for UFO and alien abduction enthusiasts. It was a big deal because it was very deeply investigated, and because he was open about it. He wasn't hiding it, or he didn't hide it. It inspired books, documentaries, movies, including the 1993 film Fire in the Sky, which dramatized Walton's account. The cultural impact of the case contributed to its status as one of the most well-known abduction stories. So you're talking about 18 years later. There's a film about it, and I remember when the film came out. It was kind of a big deal because it did approach it. It approached the story as being from Walton's perspective. So it approached it as being factually true. It wasn't a movie about like, what did this happen or didn't this happen? It was like, this is what happened. So despite the media attention, public interest, the Walton case faced skepticism, controversy. Critics questioned the credibility of his account and the possibility of alternative explanations for the events. Some argued that his experience could be attributed to psychological factors such as hallucinations or false memories. So, and of course, it could be. It could also be, aliens. There was a lot of, it can't be this because it can't be this, right? Like, so no one really came up with a plausible, they came up with a plausible, but no one was able to prove what they were saying either. So they essentially were saying, well, he could have been drunk, but there's no evidence that he was drunk,
honestly, what would have caused those burns? Why,
right.
The fact that they're all reporting the same thing.
And you can just say, well, we just elected to not believe him, and that's fine. But you can't make an assertion like that without doing something to support it. But of course, you can in the court of public opinion. And I
don't know if paranormal fever was running rampant through logging communities in rural areas at the time. You know what I mean? Again, there was no internet. There's not.
No, I think it was, you said, more
3 TV.
I think it was more along the lines of hoaxing, in that they could pull the rug under, or, pull the wool out, and maybe make a couple of bucks by selling it to the Inquirer. I think that's what people were thinking, or that they had been doing something wrong, and this was something that they did to cover it up. So, he tried to run away from home, or he wanted to get out of doing something, and so this became the cover, or they did something to him, or there was something untoward going on, and they were using it as cover. That was the implication.
And Kathy, he's 22 years old at this point. He's about 22 when he's abducted. Was he born in 53?
Hold on. He was born in 53. Yeah, so he's 22 years old. Yeah.
God,
so you
what
could
a nightmare.
See it. You could see it like he misses work for 5 or 6 days, goes on a bender. I mean, that's the perspective of people, which I'm going to say, a lot of times it's like, well, that seems a little bit more realistic than an alien coming down and abducting him. You know,
So did he describe what happened
yeah,
on?
but we'll get to
Okay.
that. We'll get to
Okay.
that. So, so he describes it in detail. So, so it's this case is often discussed within the context of UFO and alien abduction theories because it's very well known. Proponents of the theories argue that the case provides evidence of extraterrestrial encounters and advanced technology, and the consistency of Walton's account. And remember, it's 50 years later; he's still telling the same story. And the corroboration of his crew members are cited as supporting evidence. So there are people who will never believe firsthand accounts. They'll say, well, that's just evidence that they learned the story. I'm not one of them. I tend to lean in on those things because I think it's very difficult to maintain a lie for as long as especially under the pressure that they had. Although I will say the Collingswood Fairies is a good story. We'll talk about that at some other point.
Okay.
I'm dropping that in there for the future. Psychological explanations for the Walton case include the possibility of hallucinations, false memories, some other kind of cognitive phenomena, some kind of behavioral issues. Some researchers suggest that Walton's experience could be the result of psychological stress or a misinterpretation of more ordinary events. And I get that, right? He could have misconstrued it. He believed it was that. It could have been the government. It could have been a lot of different things. So sociocultural factors also played a role in the interpretations of this case. In the late 1970s, it was we just talked about this. There was a period of increased interest in UFOs, extraterrestrial life, influenced by movies, popular culture, media coverage, and also just what was going on in the space race, right? And plus the fear mongering of what was going on in the space race. So the case has a lasting effect. It's had a lasting impact on UFO research and the study of alien abductions, and it remains a key reference point for researchers and enthusiasts to this day, exploring the phenomena of alien encounters. It has contributed to the development of theories and the frameworks for understanding UFO abductions. It's still something, despite it being almost 50 years, it's still something people talk about. If you go to any cons or you read up on MUFON or you reach out to Skeptical Inquirer, this is one of those cases that even the most skeptical person says, I don't believe his interpretation of this, but I believe it happened. So I don't believe it was a UFO that did it, but I believe that this man had some experience, but he misinterpreted that. So even the most skeptical person, the most skeptical people, after 50 years of these guys talking about it, are like, yeah, something went down there. I don't think it was aliens because it can't be aliens, which of course
dying to know, Kathy, what happened on this ship, though.
So
because that's a thing.
So I mean, honestly, what happened on the ship was what always seems to happen, right? So in his initial perspective, he was probed, right? So there was medical experimentations on him. He was terrified. There were 3 beings that he interacted with. I even think one of them was what he perceived as being female, which was interesting because you don't always see that. But he was on this. He was taken on this beam. He was brought into a facility where, in the early part of his discussion, or in his when he talked about this event and talked about what happened during this event, he was terrified because he did believe that there was some kind of medical experimentation. Parts of his body were, he felt physical pain. He felt that they were using him as some kind of laboratory rat to understand the human biology better. And so he was terrified. And then they kind of dropped him back to Earth. They brought him, they put him back on Earth, or back on the back on the ground. And with some memory, and the memories became clearer as time went by. So when I talked about how his perspective of this changed. So for the first many, many years, he looked at this through the lens of his fear, right? Of, think of you picking up a little kitten, right?
Mm.
Right? And the kitten doesn't know you. So the kitten's afraid because it doesn't know what's going to happen to it. And he was the kitten. And so his interpretation of what they did was that they were performing some kind of nefarious uh, uh, medical experimentations on him. So in other words, they were using him without consent to broaden their scientific knowledge of them. He has since come to believe that when he got struck by that beam, it was accidental and it physically damaged him. And they were saving him. So it was an accident, right? They pulled up, they were hovering in the woods. He jumped out, he ran out, the beam hit him accidentally, causing radiation burns to his body. And in an effort to save him, they brought him up into the craft, and they were not performing medical experiments on him. They were performing medical procedures on him to save his life. So he has become that. That's where he has come to after 40 some odd years. He's like, I look at this now. He has had other visitations, or he's
That's
had
what I was going to ask you.
He has not necessarily with these, but he has had moments where he says, I felt their presence again. But he said, he's like, there's not a day that I don't think about this. And he realized that his interpretation of what happened to him was through the lens of fear and through the lens of something happening to him, right? As opposed to what actually happened, and looking at the broader scope of what actually happened. And the way he looks at it now is everything was kind of accidental. I jumped out to go look at something. I spread into this beam of light that burned me and probably would have killed me. And had they not taken me into their ship and performed life-saving medical intervention, I would have died. And that they then essentially, and he said, I was terrified, but there was nothing in what they did because they didn't kill him, right? They could have, and so he said he has come to believe that what actually happened to him was, it was kind of like he was a deer on the road. And instead of just pushing the deer off to the side of the road, they healed him. And I find that fascinating, and it goes a lot to what we've talked about in other things, which is our interpretation of things based on our fear of them, right? So we give an intent to these events, right? And after 40 years of sitting with it, he's come to the conclusion that his interpretation was wrong. He's, I was a young person. I was afraid of this. I did not know. And then as time has gone by sitting with it and kind of really exploring it, he believes that he was actually saved by them instead of being experimented on.
So, Kathy, he's been visited by not the same aliens, but other aliens.
I don't know that I would call them visitations. I think what he's saying is, I'm open to this, so I have other experiences, but he's never actually said it was, strictly a visitation, or in other words, he feels an openness to if there's something else around him. I don't think that he's ever claimed to be abducted again, or even been invited or had anything, but he is kind of like, when I'm around other people who've had these experiences, I'm open to it, and I can get a kind of a sense of presence sometimes around them.
So my first, I'm not saying it's skeptical, but I'm just putting on my social scientist hat here, and that, yes, could it be that he's reinterpreting and he's more accurate now that his fear is a little bit more in the distance, and that it was benign and in fact benevolent that they tried to help him? Okay. However, Another one could be, do people create a narrative that helps to resolve or deny an incredible trauma?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. This past weekend, a woman who's in my, I meet online with Lynn every other week with this class. I've done that for a few years. And there's a woman who's newer to the class, but I saw her at this event. And, she approached me and was talking about, among other things, that she's had numerous alien abductions. She at first was very frightened. I guess she would not call them abductions now. She would call them visitations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like numerous. And she feels it's one of the most spiritually transformative things that in her life. And was, without going into detail, was trying to engage me around this. And I just said, listen, I'm so happy, honestly, that it was spiritually transformative for you. I believe that it was. And this isn't something I actually really even want to delve into, because I hope I get through my whole life without any sort of visitation.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, this crowd, I don't think there is anyone there who would say there are no aliens. And in fact, I know this is a tangent from there. I don't think I asked Lynn about this in the interview for this podcast, but he's been on other podcasts, and, he's a little bit, he's thoughtful about when he shares this stuff and what he shares. But he was in military intelligence for a long time. He had at one point the highest level of clearance, like above top secret. He has said that the government has known about aliens for decades and decades, that there has been collaboration with them, but I wouldn't say it's generally known throughout the military. And he said that at one point he was asked to write some sort of report on alien life, like what's out there. And I might get the details of this wrong, so don't at me, people. Just correct me in the comments. But he said that there's at least 4 types, like large subtypes. 2 that would probably wish us harm, and 2 that are either neutral to benevolent. And what's interesting is he said there's one that is far more psychic than we are, but they don't have the range we do. So they're more accurate, but it's very limited in space and time. So they kind of want to take us out. I think, again, if I get this wrong, let me know. And another one that just maybe wants to learn from us. Some other group that wants to help us. And that's great. I just feel like I don't know that I personally have the bandwidth to want to. I certainly don't want to be visited. And I in the whole realm of paranormal, not that the demonic stuff isn't unnerving. It is. I don't want to be visited by a demon either. But for some reason, as you said at the beginning, I don't think it's that it's less unsettling, but it's unsettling in a different way.
Right. And listen, these are all words that we're using, right? Like we're naming things, what we're naming them, and we're interpreting them the way. I mean, who's to say that aliens aren't demons in some cases, or we're just using that word. And I mean, I do have to say, I don't lean, and this is not me saying that people are wrong or it's just not my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
As far as alien abductions or things like that, it's not something. It terrifies me, but it's not something I'm particularly interested in, and I'm not really invested in it being true or not true or whatever. And I do have friends who really are into it, and absolutely believe it. I do, me, I tend to lean a little bit more out of that realm. I tend to lean a little bit. I don't even want to say skeptical, but I tend to just be like, it's just not my thing. Because I start getting into the well, how long, how many times you have to probe someone, to figure out that how the body works, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but that could also just be because I don't have the full, I don't have the full plot. I find Travis Walton's case really interesting though, because we have this idea that, so you say there's 4 types of aliens
I mean, I'm
that
sure
we
there's
know
more.
of, or that
Yeah.
are purported.
I think you're
right?
saying broad categories.
Right. We're just saying 4 broad categories. But there are individuals within that, right? And so who's to say that these aren't like teenagers out cruising the galaxy? And but I mean, really, I mean, to me, the um, big pullback in all of this is space travel, and how incredibly difficult it would be if we're talking about physical beings who are kind of in the same space time as us and have the same kind of physical limitations. And I'm not talking about physical limitations as far as their body. I'm talking about physical limitations as far as the galaxy and how
Right.
how matter works. That how incredibly advanced they would have to be to do that kind of physical space travel. I'm not talking about spiritual. I'm not talking about psychic. I'm not
I don't
talking
know.
about, kind of the transcendental kind of stuff. But
Right.
so to me, that's really interesting. But what I found really interesting about this case is there are lots of cases out there. And I actually have in my museum a series of MUFON cases from the late 50s. And they're on mimeograph.
Oh,
So
okay.
somebody actually mimeographed them, and they're hand-signed reports. So there were lots of reports here in New Jersey, but a collector, he actually is still alive. He hasn't passed away, but he decided that he wanted his library to go to somebody before he died. And so
Okay.
I have all of these things, and then I have these great old handwritten, reports. And I've read through some of them, and the cases are compelling because people are clearly emotionally reactive in them. But they're not compelling from the perspective that you couldn't explain them in some other way. And
Right.
and I don't think that that's the standard. Right. I mean, there's lots of things that could be, the door is open. Well, maybe the neighbor opened. Maybe, maybe there was a draft. So everything can be explained in multiple ways.
Right.
But what I find interesting about the Travis Walton case is the longevity of it, and the fact that these guys took a beating for decades and did not walk back what what they said. And I had used the Collingswood fairies, which is a very famous photography evidentiary photos with Arthur Conan Doyle. If you've ever, unfortunately, Arthur Conan Doyle was not the most skeptical of paranormal researchers, but he actually, these little girls took fairies out of magazines and then brought their brownie camera down to a river and took pictures of themselves with these little fairies. And Conan Doyle considered them evidence of the existence of fairies. And for years, for literally 60 years, people were like, well, maybe they were, until right before one of the young women died, I think in like the 90s. She was like, no, we cut those out of postcards, out of magazines. But in the case of the Travis Walton, these guys were anathema. They were pariahs in their community. And one of them, I remember, there's an interview of him in one of the documentaries, and you can just feel when he's talking about how much this destroyed his like it undermined his faith in everything. And then on top of that, he was just like he started drinking, and he never changed his story. And there's something about it that is so compelling. And again, I don't claim to know whether their interpretation is true, but I do believe these guys had an experience that was beyond what we would consider normal. It was beyond a kind of casual or common experience. Was it aliens? I don't know. If it wasn't, it was something that we don't know about. It was definitely something that we don't know about. But I thought I would bring that case to us because as a little bit of a palate cleanse, and I do have to say,
lighter than demons.
I have to say, I think it's weird that you brought it up before I did.
Well, we've had instances of telepathy, and just I would never expect you to do this because I know that you're like, I'm not into aliens. But what do you all think? What do you think? Have you heard of this case? Does it seem compelling to you? Leave us a comment. Let us know.
And if you've had an experience, if you've had an experience, I know it's hard to sometimes kind of come out of the closet as someone who's had an experience because you're afraid you're not going to be in a safe space. You're obviously in a safe space with us. But if you want to send us an email, we can discuss your case anonymously. We'd love to hear about it. We'd also love to hear about cases that you find very convincing, or cases that you'd like us to delve into. I thought this subject was really, really interesting, and it's part of the reason why it's so interesting is because it's not something that I commonly pursue. So this absolutely it's absolutely made me curious, and it's absolutely worth exploring.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathy. And
thanks, Trace.
Thank you, everybody. This has been another episode of Curious Explorers. If you like the episode, please remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment. And until next time, stay curious.
Keep exploring.
You've just listened to the Curious Explorers podcast with the Kathy Kelly and Traci Stein. If you enjoyed the episode, remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment, let us know what you think. And of course, until next time, stay curious.